Bonsoir, good evening, and welcome to the 15th Annual Kreisel Lecture. My name is Marie Carrière. I'm the director of the CLC, and I'm very happy to welcome you. And I would first like to acknowledge our location on Treaty 6 territory and in the region of the Métis region number 4, where we attempt good and respectful relations in the wake of past and ongoing wrongs, in our present of resurgences, with a look to future rebuilding. We are really delighted at the CLC to welcome Leanne Simpson this evening. And I'm again very delighted to welcome you and our wonderful sponsors, and you will hear about our sponsors and our partners in a moment from our Dean of Arts. Professor Cormack is a scholar of history here, of course, in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. She has been really a staunch and incredible supporter of the CLC over these past 9 years. Her belief in the mission of the CLC and the abilities and capabilities of the team to deliver that mission, and these things have been really essential, and I cannot understate that. And so without further ado, I will ask you to welcome Dr. Leslie Cormack to the stage. We'll see you at the other end. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and the University of Alberta, I'm really delighted to welcome you all and thank you for coming out tonight. As many of you know, the Kreisel Lecture is an annual event hosted by the Canadian Literature Centre, the Centre de Littérature Canadienne. This lecture series is established in the memory of Professor Henry Kreisel. Professor Kreisel was, of course, the chair of English and vice president academic at the University of Alberta in the 1960s and 1970s. Austrian-born and Jewish, Professor Kreisel was interned in Canada during the Second World War. As a war refugee, he spoke of being an accidental immigrant to Canada and how, as a newcomer, he went looking for Canadian literature in order to understand this country that he was now in, but no one could tell him where to find it. And so he took matters into his own hands, introducing and teaching the first courses in Canadian literature at the University of Alberta, and inspiring a love of the written word to generations of students. He's also one of the first modern writers to introduce the immigrant experience to the field of Canadian literature. Indeed, this is one of his many legacies that only grows stronger as we continue to grapple with who we are as a nation. The annual Kreisel Lecture is a celebration of Canadian writing, but it's also a recognition of the importance of public intellectual exchange. In the Faculty of Arts, we're proud to be the home of the Canadian Literature Centre. This successful research centre tackles key societal issues in its role as the Western hub of the Canadian literary community. It's a forum for open, inclusive, critical thinking, and cultural engagement, and it also works to bring together authors, readers, researchers, students, and teachers from across the country. And of course, the CLC continues to publish the highly acclaimed 18 Bridges literary magazine. I'd like to thank the people at CLC who make all of this possible. In particular, Dr. Marie Carrière, that you just saw, who is the director, and her team at the center. The Kreisel Lecture Series is successful because of its strong partnerships. And so I would very much like to thank the University of Alberta Press, who co-publishes the Kreisel series with the Canadian Literature Centre, and to CBC Radio Ideas team, who are here tonight recording the lecture for broadcast at a later date. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the University of Alberta's Intersections of Gender Signature Area, the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, Starfest, St. Albert's Readers Festival, the CRC in Comparative Indigenous Feminist Studies, and the Office of the Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research. And of course, I'd like to thank Eric and Alexis Schloss for their generous founding gift and also their continuing support of CLC over the years. In addition to donating over 40,000 books to the University of Alberta libraries and supporting annual lectureships in human rights and the Holocaust, the Schlosses established the Canadian Literature Centre in the Faculty of Arts in 2006, the only national bilingual research literature centre in Canada. In 2017, Dr. Schloss was appointed to the Order of Canada, joining his wife, Alexis, who had already been appointed in 2014, so the girls win. So congratulations to both Dr. Schlosses for that. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Jordan Abel, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Jordan Abel is a Nisga's writer from Vancouver. He is the author of The Place of Scraps, winner of the Dorothy Livesey Poetry Prize, Uninhabited, and Injun, which earned him the 2017 Griffin Poetry Prize, Canada's most generous poetry prize. Jordan's latest project, Nishga, which will be published in April, is a deeply personal book that attempts to address the complications of contemporary Indigenous existence and the often invisible intergenerational impact of residential schools. Jordan is also, I'm very pleased and proud to say, an assistant professor in the Department of English and Film Studies here at the University of Alberta, where he teaches Indigenous literatures and creative writing. So please, welcome to the stage, Jordan Abel.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Jordan. I just wanted to, I know we've already done it, but I wanted to start out this evening, or my part of the evening anyway, with one of the University of Alberta's territorial acknowledgements. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. I think this acknowledgement is a great starting place, but is always insufficient in so many ways. And hopefully the work that I do here tonight helps to address that in some way. I also want to start out by saying thank you so much to the Canadian Literature Centre and to the organizers, all of the organizers of this Kreisel lecture series, for inviting one of my favorite authors ever to deliver tonight's lecture. It is such a privilege and a joy to share this space. I think the best way for me to do that is to share with you three kind of moments where I have encountered both Leanne Simpson's work and also Leanne Simpson. The first time I encountered Leanne Simpson's work was during my PhD program. I had been reading all kinds of Indigenous writing, including some wonderful books by folks like Daniel Heath Justice, Craig Womack, Linda Sahiwe Smith, Lee Maracle, Bonita Lawrence, Joyce Green, and Glenn Coulthard. One of the very first essays I wrote in my PhD was about Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson. And when I think back on it, I remember being completely enamored by one of Simpson's arguments in Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. The argument was that Simpson put out there came from an Anishinaabe idea that one needs to be very, very careful with making judgments and with the act of criticism. And I think if I understand that idea correctly, it's not so much that we can't or that we shouldn't be critiquing things, but that we need to think very deeply on it before we act. And likewise, I remember being very surprised when I turned back to Glenn Coulthard's work in Red Skin, White Masks, and realized that there seemed to be very little that was offered beyond critique in that work. And in the conclusion of that book, when Coulthard finally moves away from critique and points towards the very difficult work of imagining a pathway forward. He turns to Leanne Simpson's vision of Indigenous Resurgence as being a site of possibility for Indigenous futurity. In Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Simpson writes that critique and revelation cannot, in and of themselves, create the kinds of magnificent change our people are looking for. And that instead of spending all of our time critiquing, we should be spending an enormous amount of energy recovering and rebuilding. Simpson's thinking here kind of blew my mind a little bit. And that the idea that one needs to be very, very careful with making judgments and with the act of criticism really challenged me to think outside of the usual structures and try to do something more generative. The second time I encountered Leanne Simpson was actually, I encountered Leanne Simpson, the person, and it was in a much different context. I just launched my third book, which is a book called Engine, and both Leanne and I were reading together in Vancouver. I can't recall exactly where it was in Vancouver, but it was somewhere downtown on what was probably a very rainy, gray night. And I believe Leanne Simpson was reading from her first collection of short stories, poems, and songs, a book called Islands of Decolonial Love. And I was performing my sound poetry from Engine. I remember when we finally introduced ourselves to each other, it felt as though we'd already known each other for such a long time. I also remember very clearly that Leanne had told me that when she had read my book Engine, that it sounded very, very different in her head than when it did in my performance, which I'm pretty sure I apologize profusely for. But I think, for the lack of better ways to describe that moment, I was actually very starstruck. After all, Islands of Decolonial Love was a book that everyone was talking about. Lee Miracle, for example, wrote this about the book. Islands of Decolonial Love is the sort of book I've been looking for all my life. The kind of book that is going to make me a good writer, a good listener, a good citizen. It is going to wake up everything that is brilliant in everyone that reads it. And at the same time, other important Indigenous folks like Richard Van Camp were saying that this was a book of astounding storytelling and wondrous prose. And also that Islands of Decolonial Love is a constellation of galaxies that I never want to leave. I think no one would fault me for my love of Leanne Simpson's work, but I do have to admit it was so much different to hear her and to think through her work in this context. In the academic context, I think the response was a bit more muted, a bit more reserved, and I think they're perhaps afraid to gush about how much they loved Leanne Simpson's work. But in this moment, in this celebration of literature and creativity, I am not afraid to gush about her work. I really love it. And I will also say that I think this moment where I got to share the stage with one of my favorite writers was one that I will hold with me forever. The third time I encountered Leanne Simpson was again a very different context. It was during the New Constellations tour in Winnipeg. And I remember I had gotten really sick just a few weeks before and decided not to get on the tour bus and not to come to Edmonton and Calgary. And instead, I just met up with the tour in Winnipeg, where I'd been hanging out as the writer-in-residence at the University of Manitoba. I think I was invited on this tour as a poet, even though music really seemed to be the center. And when I got on stage and read my poems, I felt very out of place, even though everyone was very nice about it. It's tough to be on the same stage as Jeremy Dutcher and Maud Bounce and John K. Sampson and Jason Colletts and July Talk. I am just a poet. But Leanne Simpson was there not as Indigenous philosopher, not as a writer of short fiction. She was there as a musician. She had a band, she had a guitar, and she was also kind of a rock star. And I remember when I was talking to her after the show, it was so clear that she had literally been living the rock star life of the tour bus, going from city to city with other musicians, fighting for a shower whenever they stopped in a new town. And I think this is all to say that Leanne Simpson is an absolutely multi-talented gem, and I think we would be hard-pressed to find anyone nearly as talented across so many different genres and fields. This is demonstrated very well by all of the writers who have thought about her work and taken it up. You know, for example, Thomas King writes that Leanne is a gifted writer who brings passion and commitment to her storytelling and who has demonstrated an uncommon ability to manage an impressive range of genres, from traditional storytelling to critical analysis, from poetry to the spoken word, from literary and social activism to songwriting. She is, in my opinion, one of the more articulate and engaged voices of her generation. I am absolutely in awe of what Simpson has been able to accomplish, and I think we are extraordinarily lucky to continue to read, to continue to listen to, and to continue to think with this absolutely brilliant human being. As Katarina Vermette has said, Simpson is a master lyricist, a captivating storyteller, and a true gift to us all. Please join me in welcoming Leanne Simpson.
Tanze, ani kinawaya, oki, ambe wastach. Giriga vijuna denawema, kinagachi nishnabek ogami nadonjaba, nagojawani megwadoda, Betasamosake Nadijnakaz. Nigichinendam gibijayan nongama andai egg, and Miss Squatchy was Skywagun, Treaty 6, Papase, Minawa Meti Aking, Miigwech, hi. I am Michi Sagik Nishnaabewin or Ojibwe, and our territory is the north shore of Lake Ontario, roughly between the cities of Toronto and Ottawa. My particular understanding of life comes from this part of the world. It comes from this Michi Sagik Nishnaabewin practice of life, living in deep relationality to the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the peoples of Kinagachi and Nishnaabewin Ogaming, the place where we all live and work together. It comes from Nayano, Nibimong, Gichigaming, the Great Lakes. It comes from maple sugar bushes carrying and filtering water from the soil, combining it with light, and converting it to sweet sugar. It comes from lake shores full of monomen or wild rice, gathering strength in mid-July and moving from floating form to standing upright. It comes from black bears that wake up in Makwagisis, February, turn in their dens on beds of blueberry branches, and then settle back into fasting and dreaming for a few more weeks. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is continual, reciprocal, and reflective. It is a sometimes critical engagement with my ancestors, those yet to be born, and the nations of beings with whom I share land. It is a living constellation of co-resistance with all of the anti-colonial peoples and the worlds they build. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is a persistent world-building process, despite of and in spite of the constant imposition of the colonial machinery of elimination. This procedure for Indigenous life and Indigenous living is one that Indigenous peoples used long before our existence ever depended upon our ability to resist and survive the violence of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and expansive dispossession. My ancestors woke up each morning and created an Anishinaabe world. They animated their political system of governance and diplomacy. They built their collective philosophical and ethical understandings. They made processes for solving conflicts and reestablishing balance. And they built their economy with the consent of plant and animal nations. They built, maintained, and nurtured systems for sharing knowledge and taking care of each other. They worked collectively to produce, reproduce, replicate, amplify, and share Indigenous life, because if they did not, Anishinaabe worlds wouldn't exist. They were makers. They got up each morning and they worked hard, not the white man wage labor, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of work, not the kind of work where you outsource the labor of living so you can do something more important, but the kind of work that values above all else the way one lives. They got up, worked hard all day long, and they brought forth more life. This algorithm for living, theory and praxis seemingly intertwined and relationally responsive to each other, is generated through intimate relations with Michi-Sagik and Nishnaabeg land that is constructed and defined by our responsive intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and physical relationality. Living as a creative act, self-determination, consent, kindness, and freedom practiced daily in all our relations. Practices replicated over and over, making as the material basis for experiencing and influencing the world, living with the purpose of generating continual life. Our infrastructure for life was relationships, not institutions. Our orientation for life was internationalist. We shared space and time with plant and animal nations and different Indigenous nations, mostly without the use of enclosure and violence. We did not bank capital to protect us against hard times. We had interdependent relationships with animal and plant nations, other human families, and neighboring Indigenous nations. In times of difficulty, we relied upon this practice of relational diplomacy and the world it creates to survive, with the understanding that in return, we would also take care of their worlds. We have always been an intellectual and an artistic people. We have always had theory, meaning, philosophy, aesthetic principles, and those things were considered and celebrated on nights like this through the practice of storytelling. My people are constant storytellers throughout the day and throughout the seasons. Stories are the fabric of daily life. The sonics of story pulls one into space where worlds are fully embodied experience. The sound is the connector to emotions and intellect beyond one's own body. It is a connector to all of the relations that make up the land. The land holds story. From this is the place where when you were 2, you got stung by a bee and fell into the beaver pond, to before that monster cottage was built on the island your great-grandparents always camped there on the way to town, to remember that time Nana Bush transformed into a tree but forgot that one body part, to the place where you first tasted smart berries, and look, there are geese flying overhead in a V. Stories not only fill our worlds, they make our worlds, but only if you have the skills to find meaning in oral literature, but only if story lives and breathes inside of you, but only if you wrap stories around you like a blanket and take them out from time to time to consider. Storytelling is a foundational practice of Indigenous peoples. The practice of telling stories fills the interstitial spaces of worlds with recognition and affirmation, with all of that generative and degenerative energy. It is a practice of listening with one's open heart to the sound of Anishinaabe across time and space in all of our manifestations. The practice of telling stories is a practice of generating a diversity of meanings. It is a practice of deep relationality, not a looking at, but a looking with, or a looking through, or a thinking through together. The practice of telling stories is a practice of contracting and releasing sound across scale, articulating our individual experiences, relating them to collective experiences, and generating systemic critique. More important than the telling is the culture of listening. The practice of telling stories is a practice of constantly building Anishinaabe worlds while simultaneously living in them. We are bodies made of story and connection, hubs in the network of Indigenous living, and our practice of telling stories is one of the reasons that I am here tonight, in spite of centuries of colonial violence. This month, we've witnessed a phenomenal expression of Indigenous international diplomacy as Indigenous peoples across Canada have mobilized in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their clans in the form of rallies, round dances, teach-ins, benefit concerts, sit-ins, and of course, blockades. We have also witnessed the usual vitriol white racism and backlash to those expressions of solidarity online, in the media, at the front lines, and from Canada's so-called leaders. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have repeatedly stated that there is no access to their lands without their consent. And over the past 2 decades, they have done everything possible within current structures to protect their lands. When the RCMP invaded their territory to enforce a court injunction to make way for the construction of a pipeline, they asked us for our support in protecting their lands and their peoples from the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Canada has a long present and a long history of ignoring Indigenous consent when it comes to resource extraction on our territories, and they have always undermined our self-determination to decide what is best for our peoples and our land. Canada has a long present and a long history of ignoring Black consent when it comes to environmental harm, self-determination, freedom, and the proliferation of Black life. Catherine Yusof writes, "In a billion Black Anthropocenes or none." If the Anthropocene proclaims a sudden concern with the exposure of environmental harm to white liberal communities, it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly exported to Black and Brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernization, and capitalism. The Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialism have been ending worlds for as long as they have been in existence. Indeed, poet, novelist, and playwright Bessie Phillips writes, "North America is founded upon 2 genocides, Black peoples and Indigenous peoples." The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are teaching the world a crucial message about consent. They've used the Canadian courts in the landmark Delgamuukw decision. They've educated the public on speaking tours in videos, a website, and camp tours. And they have built the alternative, a land immersive community with cabins, a pit house, bunkhouses, and a healing center at the Onistaden camp. A tremendous expression of life-giving Wet'suwet'en law, politics, economy, and love. A Wet'suwet'en world. No means no, with Indigenous bodies and Indigenous land. Yellowknives Dene political theorist Glenn Coulthard, in a blog post entitled "For Indigenous Nations to Live, Capitalism Must Die," posted during Idle No More, says that the state has always placed limits on Indigenous efforts to protect our lands. There are clear demarcations between moral and legitimate forms of defending our rights and morally illegitimate methods, deemed so because of their disruptive or extra-legal character. Legitimate forms of protecting our rights are usually negotiations between state-sanctioned Aboriginal leadership and the Crown, along with symbolic acts of peaceful and non-disruptive demonstrations sanctioned by Canadian law. Morally illegitimate tactics are forms of protest and direct action that are less mediated and sometimes more disruptive, like slowing traffic, temporary blockades, and the reoccupation of Indigenous lands through the establishment of reclamation sites that also serve to disrupt, if not entirely block, access to Indigenous territory by state and capital for prolonged periods of time. As Coulthard writes, most often, morally illegitimate activities get branded in the media in a negative manner as reactionary, threatening, dangerous, and disruptives. Indigenous blockades are indeed a challenge to the dominant political and economic systems of Canada. They are indeed an amplification and a centering of Indigenous political economies, Indigenous forms of governance, economy, production, and exchange. They are indeed a resurgence of social and political practices, ethics, and knowledge systems. In reality, behind the barricades, whether the blockades are enacted on Anishinaabe land at Grassy Narrows, Dakota land at Standing Rock, at the Port of Vancouver, or at the Onistaden camp, blockades are rich sites of radical resurgence. In the spaces behind the barricades, you'll find parents with children, you'll find elders, you'll encounter ceremony, sacred fires, and language learning, art making, singing, drumming, storytelling. You'll find an ethic of care as harvesters and cooks engage in a bush economy to feed the front lines alongside spiritual leaders, nurses, and medics taking care of the people. You will notice a mobilized network of support and solidarity extending well beyond the barricades. You will witness the reemergence of political leaders based not on a band council election, but upon Indigenous practices of deep relationality. You will enter a collective embodiment of Indigenous legal practices. You will hear the sound of political, intellectual, and spiritual engagement in these rich sites of knowledge production, and you'll see Indigenous anti-colonial theory generated through collective practice. You will witness a radically different political existence and ethical orientation in spite of the dominance of colonialism. Existences and orientations that are operating upon a different premises than the politics and economy of extraction. Living as a creative act, self-determination, consent, kindness, and freedom practiced daily in all our relations. Practices replicated over and over, making as the material basis for experiencing and influencing the world, living with the purpose of generating continual life. Nishnaabewin. Tonight, I want to step away from the usual ways blockades are portrayed in the media and understood by the majority of Canadians. I want to spend some time tonight thinking about this practice of the blockade in a different way, in an Anishinaabe way, that is in conversation with the Wet'suwet'en, Nehiyawak, Blackfoot, Stoney Nakoda, Métis peoples, and the indigenous brilliance of this particular place in the spirit of Indigenous internationalism. I want to share the brilliance of my relative, the beaver. According to the Edmonton Journal, you all have between 1,300 and 1,600 beavers living in the city, which beats Calgary's 200 and Winnipeg's 100. I think we have the glorious nature of the North Saskatchewan River to thank for that, which means we have the brilliance of the beaver among us tonight. In colonial minds, the beaver is nature's engineer, the earliest forester, the first hydrologist, the original industry. No one has had more impact on the environment than the beavers, except for humans, the Jaganash boasts. In 1975, the beaver became an emblem of Canada as a symbol of its sovereignty because the first Europeans in Indigenous territories saw the beaver not as a relative, but as a money-making attraction to supply the continent with nifty felt hats. 200 years of making beavers into accessories led to their near extinction, and now beavers are mostly known to us as a nuisance and an inconvenience. But this indigenous land, this indigenous water, these indigenous bodies house centuries of oral literature and embodied practice that know different. In many versions of the Anishinaabeg 7 ancestor teachings, beavers, or in Nishnaabewin, Amick, plural Amick Work, represents Nishnaabewin, the practice of wisdom. I want to think about that for a moment. Out of all of the beings that make up life on this planet, to my ancestors, Amick Work embodied the politics and the ethical practices of wisdom. Now, there are some pretty cool features of the beaver, and as a sporty person, I'm immediately attracted to the waterproof fur, the original Gore-Tex, webbed feet for efficiency in the pool, a third eyelid in the form of a nictitating clear membrane that moves over their eyes and acts as swim goggles you can't possibly lose, orange and ever-growing teeth with iron in them, perfect for gnawing and not susceptible to yellow stains. Then I remember for the Anishinaabe, it is not necessarily our cool and sporty features that make us who we are. It is what we do and how we live in relation to other forms of life. Amick Work build lodges, canals, and dams, and of course the longest beaver dam in the world is located north of here in Treaty 8 in Métis territory and measures 850 meters long. Amick Work build dams that create deep pools and channels that don't freeze, creating winter worlds for their fish relatives. Deep pools and channels that drought-proof the landscape. Dams that make wetlands full of moose, deer, and elk food, cooling stations, places to hide calves in, and muck to keep the flies away. Dams that open spaces in the canopy so sunlight increases, making warm and shallow aquatic habitat around the edges of ponds for amphibians and insects. Dams that create plunge pools on the downstream side for juvenile fish, gravel for spawning, and homes and food for birds. And who is the first back after a fire to start the regeneration? Amick Work. Amick is a world builder. Amick is the one that brings the water. Amick is the one that brings forth more life. Amick is the one that works continuously with water and land and plant and animal nations and consent and diplomacy to create worlds, to create shared worlds. Prior to contact with white people, it is estimated that Kinakong, the home of the turtle, was home to between 60 and 400 million beavers. That's 3 to 5 beavers for every kilometer of stream or river. That is a beaver in nearly every headwater stream in North America. Biologists call the beaver a keystone species, a species so important to an ecosystem that without it, the ecosystem would collapse. A species that continually creates habitats and food sources for other beings, families that filter and purify water, clans that replenish the soil with nutrients, communities that manage spring floods and water temperature, a nation that continually gives. A beaver dam, a blockade, life-giving, generative, affirmative, a world-building place governed by deep relationality, an expansive, fantastical sharing of space, a network of life generating blockades that built and maintained the ecosystem that the Nishnaabewin, the Nehiyawak, and Dene, for instance, lived as part of for thousands and thousands of years. Amick. Now, beaver infrastructure is quite a bit different than colonial and capitalistic infrastructure. Michi-Sagi Nishnaabewin scholar Madeline Wheatung from Curve Lake First Nation has written about this in a paper called Engendering Shoreline Law, Nishnaabewin Relational Politics Along the Trent-Severn Waterway. Madeline writes that in 1833, in Michi-Sagi Nishnaabewin territory on the north shore of Lake Ontario, a group of white settler men conspired to build a canal system of locks and dams connecting Lake Ontario, or Chinabish, to Georgian Bay, or Adawa, Hwikwadon. This was the Anishinaabe 401, a major canoe thoroughfare that had been used for centuries to quickly travel between the two big lakes. But powerful upper-class capitalists never liked canoeing as much as we did, and so a canal system in their minds was a more efficient way to bring settlers and capitalism to the territory without our knowledge and without our consent. Today, a monument stands at the Bobcaygeon Lock that celebrates the canal's purpose to open up the interior of the province and to promote agriculture, lumbering, and commerce. Indeed, Doug Williams, the Curve Lake elder Madeline and I both work with, credits the construction of the Trent-Severn Waterway as a devastating and destructive blow to Anishinaabe life, leading to the extermination of salmon and eels from our territory, flooded burial grounds and campsites, the decline of fish and animal relatives, the near destruction of monomen, or wild rice, which was the cornerstone of our food system, and an overwhelming increase in settlers. 2 dams, 2 very different outcomes. The Trent-Severn Waterway, a negation. The Beaver Dam, both a negation and an affirmation. Tonight, in our thinking through of this idea of a blockade together, I'm going to try to deepen our understandings by sharing with you 4 beaver stories. The first story takes place a long, long, long time ago, at the time of the very first beaver dam, in a time when beavers were giant. Meoja, 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 meoja. I've heard giant beaver stories in Nishnaabewin, Nehiyawak, and Dene homelands, and according to scientists, castroids lived in the Pleistocene era and were 2 meters long, weighing about 100 kilograms. So beavers roughly the size of black bears. Now, scientists don't know if giant beavers made dams, but the Anishinaabe do, and we have the stories as evidence. What follows tonight is my version of the story that was told by Sam Snake, Elijah Yellowhead, Alder York, and Annie King from the Chippewas of Rama, the Minjikining First Nation, and was originally recorded and compiled by Emerson and David Coatsworth in The Adventures of Nanabush, published in 1979. Call-out culture is exhausting, and no one knows this better than Giant Beaver and Nanabush. These two have been trading witty and not-so-witty barbs back and forth all over the country, and it's been so long that neither of them can remember what the original fight was about. But did they both ever get a spike in followers? Nishnaabewin had been stalking giant beaver around the internet for months before they lost their trail completely. It took a few days of consulting with their followers to figure out if Nishnaabewin had been blocked or if giant beaver had shut down all of their accounts and disappeared from the internet completely. When it was decided that it was the latter and all that was left was the quiet, Nishnaabewin also logged off and went back to the land with Naokamists to find solace. Naokamists set their net in the narrows between the two lakes, Gitchigaming, which you might know as Lake Superior, and Adawagaming, which you might know as Lake Huron. They built a lodge made out of saplings and bark and lined with cedar branches. They wove mats out of cattails for sleeping. They ate grouse for dinner, made mint and cedar tea, and picked medicine until it was time to check their nets. Then Naokamists tried to teach Nishnaabewin how to smoke whitefish. Nishnaabewin was pretty busy, though, reading a lot of books because they were studying for their comprehensive exams. And that is no joke, at least in certain contexts. Things were going along pretty good for those two, so good, in fact, that Nishnaabewin even considered shutting down their socials for good. Nishnaabewin and Naokamists were so relaxed, in fact, that they didn't notice it happening at first. Small, incremental change can be like that, but each day the water level was rising ever so slightly. Nishnaabewin knew immediately that giant beaver was back online under fake accounts, causing trouble. Naokamists knew immediately that giant beaver had dammed the head of the lake and was still building. Nishnaabewin fired up Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. Naokamists found the dam. Nishnaabewin clicked, posted, retweeted, and regrammed. Naokamists sat on top of the dam. Nishnaabewin memed. Naokamists waited. Nishnaabewin typed in AMIK1 serendipity style and opened all of giant beaver's accounts. Naokamists waited. Nishnaabewin opened all the platforms, screen after screen after screen, finger on delete. Naokamists waited. Nishnaabewin deleted each post seconds after they appeared. Naokamists waited. Nishnaabewin deleted. Giant beaver burst through. Naokamists grabbed on to their tail and held on. Naokamists hung on for 2 days, through the night in past exhaustion, through the day in past pain, and when they couldn't hold on any longer, giant beaver burst free, drilling through the dam to break away. Naokamists felt like a complete failure, a fraud of a Naokamist. Nishnaabewin rubbed their back. Naokamists looked up and saw giant beaver's dam blasted apart, forming the spectacular 30,000 islands in Georgian Bay, or Adawa Wikwadon. Giant beaver headed east through Kinagachi and Nishnaabewin and was gently carried by Gitchi Zibi to the ocean. Nishnaabewin ran after them, but it was too late, so Nishnaabewin called out, "I want to be your friend." Giant beaver thought, stopped, considered. And then giant beaver returned to Nishnaabewin and Naokamists to figure out how to use their beaver skills for good, which they did, and all it required was a little patience, a little resistance, some community, and a considerable reduction in size to the Amick we know and love today. Nishnaabewin. In my culture, spring is the time for fasting, and fasting is not an easy thing nowadays. We aren't used to being alone with quiet. Most of us are lucky enough to not have to go with food or water for long periods of time. Our reality is one infused with the electric of anxiety, and our bodies are ready for fight or flight when neither is the reality. So fasting, while our spiritual leaders insist on its importance, colonial realities present some particular challenges. Many elders see those challenges and offer support and certain fluidity around the practice designed, I think, to teach us slowly and gently the skills needed to complete 4 days and 4 nights. Few of us have the drive and commitment needed to accomplish this because the benefit at the end is entirely collective, wholly internal, and without accolades. When Wijiwagan decided to fast, they planned for these particular challenges years in advance. They practiced. They did the things they had been taught to do regularly, even though. And so when the day came, Naokamists put the charcoal on their face in the Anishinaabe way, and they began. Now, it isn't ethically appropriate to speak specifically about our practices of fasting or what happened in this particular fast, other than to repeat what those who have gone before me have said. John Benaci, Kagege Benaci, or Forever Bird, from what is now known as Fort William First Nation, told this story to William Jones, and it was originally published in 1919, known as The Woman Who Married a Beaver. William Jones was a Meskwaki anthropologist, and he recorded many Ojibwe stories from the western part of our territory in our language. In Kagege Benaci's published and translated version of the story, he says that during the fast, the faster, which tonight we will call Wijiwagan, meaning partner or companion, met a person who invited them into their home. Wijiwagan agreed. The home was beautiful. Food and clothing were plentiful, and in time, Wijiwagan consented to become this person's partner. When everyone agreed and the decision to be together was made, Wijiwagan lost all memories of their parents and their previous life. The two had a beautiful life together. They had 4 children, and the family was able to meet its needs through hard work. They had lots to eat. Things were good. Now, Wijiwagan's partner would sometimes leave their home for periods of time to go and visit. Sometimes they would take the children, sometimes they would go alone. Always they came back with beautiful and useful gifts: tobacco, clothing, kettles, knives, and bowls. Sometimes friends would come and visit their lodge too, but they never entered the lodge. At some point in the relationship, as happens in all long-term relationships, Wijiwagan became aware that their partner was not exactly the same as them in body, spirit, and mind. I believe we've all had this sort of experience. But at this point in time for Wijiwagan, they realized that they had entered into a relationship, a partnership with a beaver, Amick. Now let's revisit that previous paragraph in light of this new knowledge that Wijiwagan is in a relationship with a beaver. Wijiwagan's beaver partner would sometimes leave their home for periods of time to go visiting. Sometimes they would take the children. Sometimes they would go alone. Always they came back with beautiful and useful gifts: tobacco, clothing, kettles, knives, and bowls. Sometimes friends would come over and visit their lodge too, but they never entered the lodge. In Nishnaabewin, it's obvious what is happening here, but it is not so obvious in a Western worldview, so allow me to explain. In Nishnaabewin, the spiritual world is alive and influencing. It's really the main event. The physical world, which most of us are inhabiting tonight, is a sort of detritus of what happens in the spiritual world. When the beaver goes away to visit, they are being hunted by the Anishinaabe. They are consenting to give up their bodies to help the Anishinaabe feed their families. When they return, they have been killed in the physical world, and the gifts they are bringing their family, the tobacco, the clothing, the kettles, the knives, and the bowls, are gifts of reciprocity from the Anishinaabeg. This is an ethical exchange because the beaver does not have to give up their lives. They do so with consent. The gifts are an expression of international diplomacy between the Anishinaabe and the beaver. Towards the end of Amick's life, Amick asks Regeneration to speak to the visiting one the next time they come by so that they can return to the human world. Regeneration did, and they returned to the Anishinaabe. Regeneration shared their story of their life with Amick and asked the Anishinaabe to respect their relation. This is such an interesting story for me with a layered and complex intelligence embedded in it. My Turtle Mountain Ojibwe College and colleague and friend Heidi Giwedanong Benaci Stark has written a wonderful paper about this story called Respect, Responsibility, and Renewal, the Foundations of Anishinaabe Treaty Making with the United States and Canada. The story takes place in a very prosperous time for both the Beaver Nation and the Anishinaabe. We visited each other regularly. We gifted the Beavers with our most precious belongings, and the Beavers gifted the Anishinaabe with their lives in the human world so that we could feed our family. You see, there are always worlds on top of worlds, worlds underneath worlds, worlds intertwined with worlds. It's a sort of Anishinaabe string theory. There is an intricate ongoing reciprocity here practiced between individuals, families, and nations that is facilitated by visiting. Heidi also argues, and I would agree, that this story recounts the forging and functioning of a treaty relationship between Anishinaabe and Beavers. Anishinaabe responsibilities included tobacco, gifts, returning the bones of the beaver to the water to renew the treaty, and speaking out to protect beaver habitat and worlds when necessary. The beavers in turn gave up their lives in the human world and returned to the beaver world. Both nations lived without want. Both nations valued and practiced consent, sharing, caring, sovereignty, and self-determination. Both nations shared time, space, water, and land. As Madeline and Heidi point out, when the white settler men built the dams, canals, and locks of the Trans-Severn Waterway, they did so in violation of Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabe and beaver practices of consent, reciprocity, respect, and renewal. They did so in violation of Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabe and beaver diplomacy. They did so with complete disregard of the intimate political, economic, and ethical relationality that created these Anishinaabe and beaver worlds. A negation without the possibility of an affirmation, an ending of life. Let's think back to giant beaver for a second and how that first blockade created, and let's just appreciate how generative that creation was. Let's give thanks to Naokamists and Nanabush for not arresting giant beaver, destroying the blockade, and going back to business as usual. Nishnaabewin. In 2006, Steve Daniels, an electronic artist who is currently the director of new media in the RTA School of Media at Ryerson University, created an installation called Anablog. Anablog is an electromechanical community blog originally developed as a site-specific interactive installation for Blink, an annual exhibition held during Arts Week in Peterborough, Ontario. Part confessional, part message board, part soapbox, Anablog is a DIY network that stands at the intersections of private and public space, personal and community standards, revelation and surveillance, graffiti and communication, vandalism and intervention. Mimicking the internet, but physically structured around a clothesline, Anablog is a playful examination of the web phenomenon of anonymously bearing one's soul in a public space. My third Beaver story tonight riffs off of this installation and is also entitled Anablog, with an emphasis on the log part. Amick thinks we all need better communication. Amick thinks things would go better if we spent more time face-to-face in community. But, who has the time? But, who wants to see tweets in person? But, who wants to know the mediocre parts no one posts when we already have to live them anyway? Well, Amick is a maker of things, if nothing else. And Gia Tolentino says virtual signaling is the new black. And muskrat mounds made of iPhone 5s do have a particular shimmer. So. Amick stalls an old-school clothesline between two trees in the forest with a big pole in the middle for extra support. They build it in the cafe because that's where everyone goes to drink mochachinos anyway, and they install that old-school clothesline between two trees, right between all those tables and stump chairs. They get motors and wires and pulleys from the dump, and wooden clothespins from the hippies, and whammo, Anablog. Each table has its own motor and string, and you post your note with the clothespin, and then you put it up on the line for everyone to see. Bear arrives first, crushes blueberries to make a print with their middle finger up, and they put it up on the line. Wolf comes in and calls out Bear for offensive language and rips that print right off the line. Tom King shows up and writes, tell me who is left to hate? Surely there is someone new, someone missed the first time through. Tell me, shall we circle around and bring our wicked selves to the ground? Tell me. And he puts it up on the line. Buffalo writes, humility is missing and murdered from Mashkode Bajiki, and puts it up on the line. Buffalo writes, mazen means fancy, figured, an image. Abik means mineral, rock, metal, soil, solid. Ewebenon means forcefully, by hard fling, throwing, or shoving by hand. Mazenebekiwebenon, computer or typewriter, from Mashkode Bajiki, and puts it up on the line. Buffalo writes, the sound of stealing kids is dead silence, from Mashkode Bajiki, and puts it up on the line. Sabe writes, this isn't having the effect you think it's having, and puts it up on the line. Buffalo writes, Omimi, the extinct passenger pigeon, from Mashkode Bajiki, and puts it up on the line. Eagle writes, the settling silence of 2.9 billion missing and murdered birds since 1970. Eagle writes, 2 out of 5 Baltimore Orioles, 9 out of 10 evening grosbeaks, 6 out of 10 wood thrushes, 2 out of 5 barn swallows, 3 out of 4 eastern meadowlarks, 1 out of 4 of all Benaci. Eagle writes, rookeries of 10,000 nests, flocks a mile wide, 300 miles long, taking 14 hours of dark skies to pass. Imagine, and puts it up on the line. Amick writes, the internet negates humility, hashtag Mashkode Bajiki says, and puts it up on the line. Wolf posts, the emperor has no clothes, hashtag Amick, and puts it up on the line. Snake posts, eagle is self-serving, and puts it up on the line. Moose follows with Amick is plagiarism, and puts it up on the line. Raccoon writes, if Amick hadn't built that selfie station at the Edmonton airport, I never would have gone there thinking it was a real beaver lodge, and puts it up on the line. Skunk writes, Amick has a gross relationship with muskrat, and puts it up on the line. Crow writes, Amick isn't really an Amick, and puts it up on the line. Amick takes a photo of their authentic Eastern Woodland beaver card and puts it up on the line. Sabe writes, C2H4N, the formula for polyethylene, and puts it up on the line. Caribou Scotch tapes Bear's obscene paw print back together and puts it back up on the line. Birch rewrites Wolf's post about Bear being obscene and adds hashtag violence, hashtag solidarity, hashtag I believe. Deer takes a photo of Snapping Turtle at the cafe doing nothing and puts it up on the line along with a hashtag complacent and gross. Snapping Turtle never goes to the cafe again. Amick visits Bear in person, face-to-face, and gifts them Amick's castoreum. Amick visits Eagle in person, face-to-face, and gifts them Amick's tail. Amick visits Buffalo in person, face-to-face, and gifts them Amick's front teeth. Amick visits Sabe in person, face-to-face, and gifts them Amick's hide. Amick visits Wolf in person, face-to-face, and gifts them Amick's meat and bones. Amick visits Snapping Turtle in person, face-to-face, and gives them Amick's brains. Amick sneaks back to the cafe in the dead of night, gnaws down the poles, cuts the line, takes the motors back to the dump, and then lies down and leaves this world. Oh, Mimi sings, calling out, calling in, you're not fooling me. Tethered to the kinship of disassociated zeros and ones, shining your crown of neoliberal likes, yelling the loudest in the empty room, gathering followers like berries, feeding fish to insecurity, sliding into reckless moment after reckless moment. We witness too many holes in your hide, the broken skin of a canoe, the tightening of a mind, tracks leading nowhere. At the beach, we build a fire, sit in our own silence, peel off blue light, lie back on frozen waves, breathe in sharp air, warm into each other, careful moment after careful moment. Sometimes that little one who lives with the stars looks down and just feels proud of us. Nishnaabewin. One of the markers of aging, if you are an Indigenous parent, is when your kids hear about the protests before you do. This recently happened to me and my teenagers with the Wet'suwet'en Solidarity protest in downtown Peterborough. Instead of me taking them, they took me. Watching my kiddos step up unprompted and live their responsibilities as Machisagik and Nishnaabek was a beautiful relief. I watched them as they used their bodies to build a beaver dam. I watched them as they inherited both the breathtaking beauty of Nishnaabewin and the struggle involved in birthing new worlds. My beautiful relief sat beside another feeling well known to generations of Indigenous parents before me, the feeling of your chest closing in on labored breath as you watch the beings you most love in the world, your little beans, step off the sidewalk and use their precious bodies you've spent your life feeding, protecting, stuffing vegetables into, to block the vehicles of white people, many of whom are visibly angry, some of whom make a regular practice of erasing and devaluing Indigenous minds, bodies, and spirits. I thought of the parents of Colton Bushy, Tina Fontaine, and the family of one of my former brilliant students from Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, Misty Potts, who was last seen in March of 2015. This is not the world I wish to pass on to my children, a world where each year hope is diminished. There is currently a beaver resurgence of sorts happening on Turtle Island. Beavers have been seen round dancing in malls, blockading ports and intersections, holding teach-ins at university, handing out fully gnawed beaver sticks to hikers. Urban beavers have started to cut down trees and parks and along rivers and build dams over urban creeks, flood the odd trail or basement. They've starred in their own IMAX movie, enticed scientists into study, and rejected the stereotype of felt hat for something truer to their form. And while there are still those of us among us who would trap or shoot or relocate, there are also those of us that are watching quietly, learning, thinking through world-making together with the beaver. My final story tonight is called Amick Ode, Beaver Heart. OMG parent, what is the point of building this friggin' dam when we all know it's going to get destroyed by May and we will be right back to where we started? Amacons, which means little beaver, was making even the small things in life slightly more difficult for their parents, and it was beginning to wear on Amick. There was a lot of actual work left to do, which did not involve selfies, picking a song and listening to it for 35 seconds, and incessant complaining. Why are we building a dam anyway? This sucks. Let's build a selfie station. The apocalypse could not come fast enough for Amick. Also, there is no way I'm friggin' going swimming. Amick hoped, prayed, and worried that Amacons was learning something today, but they weren't sure they were. Amick knowledge doesn't embed itself because of one's proximity. Amick remembered the first time they were tasked with building a dam without their parents, and it was a moment. It was one of the sharp edges of life, a gathering of faith and hope, an expulsion of uncertainty, a feeling of betrayal at being left to do something on their own that eventually, with persistence, melted into a river of humility, the good kind of loneliness. Amick remembered wishing they had paid more attention to the details. They wished they had been more engaged and that this process was less a series of steps and lists and more learned. Here and now, Amick wondered what Amacons would do in a similar situation. Would they even try to build the dam on their own, or would they just sit there and drown in their abandonment, growing it until it festered into a series of tweets that would garnish heaps of likes and retweets, reinforcing their own chosen uselessness and affirming their perceived injustice? Amick felt like they were 100 years old. The world had changed. Without them, they felt cynical and out of touch and irrelevant. And they were. Back in the day before the genocide, Amick Work had networked dam every 100 meters, and it was perfection. Amick's responsibilities were a foundational part of the circuitry and the life of the stream. Dams managed water levels and flooding, removed excess nutrients and chemicals, worked as caring nurseries for salmonids and frogs, and made refuges for migrating songbirds. Before the Jagannash got here, there were 60 to 400 million of us, and by the early 1900s, that had dropped to 100,000, primarily because we are waterproof. Amacons wants to hear none of this, much less a parent lecture, so Amick lays off for now. Can you go cut some aspens about 15 centimeters in diameter? Amick leaves, headphones on, phone engaged, and Amick Work wonders how much longer than the required 20 minutes this will take. Amick is back in 1 minute with no poplar. My teeth hurt and I couldn't find any. Deep breaths. Let's go back together. Okay. Google, how big is the biggest beaver dam? 850 meters. What the hell? What the hell? Google nictitating membrane. It's a third eyelid, transparent, functions like swim goggles. Do we have these? It was a constant battle to get the kid to gnaw on enough wood to keep their teeth a reasonable size and function, and all kinds of treaties were made and broken, trading gnawing for screen time. Amick's gut sank with the thought that Amick might not be able to cut down the poplar. There was also a kind of blind faith in this, with the assumption that Amick was going to be skilled enough to get Amick's teeth onto the bark in the first place. This is all Amick's fault. They thought they were spending a reasonable amount of time on the land, more than most. Amick took gigs building selfie stations in parks and bars and airports, and mostly Amick stayed home with their screens. The stations consisted of a replica lodge, small but still enough for a family, some poplar branches strategically placed, a couple of blue backdrops for sky and water, human footprints, and good lighting. Yet, here they were, spending a week on the creek building a dam they both knew would be destroyed by the city shortly after the photos and news stories. Yet, here they were. Yet, here they were, sitting beside resentment, cynicism, self-doubt. Yet, here they were. Amick wondered if their ancestors would even recognize them. Amick wonders if they are ever going to learn anything that will improve their Minecraft beaver dam situation. Amick selects 2 trees. Amick picks the song for chewing, asks Amick to start their tree, and Amick obliges. Amick takes a mouth wide open beside the gnaw marks selfie. Amick says ratio. Amick nods slowly, watching Amick's progress out of the side of their eye. Amick is doing better than one might expect. It's working. Amick is being an Amick. There is a swell of emotion in Amick, a mixture of relief, pride, and devastating sadness, a small victory that never should have been a victory in the first place. Amick and their Amick carry the poplar back to the site in their mouths and place the branches on the shore. Amick asks Amick for a pic of the carrying, and Amick obliges because reciprocity isn't about giving back what you want, it's about giving back what is needed or what has been asked of you. Amick eats some of the buds and branches while Amick finds their gummy worms. There is a moment, a sort of sad, crappy moment, but a moment nonetheless. Then Amick takes the branch in their mouth and swims towards the dam. Nishnaabewin. Tonight, I've shared 4 Anishinaabe beaver stories with you. 4 stories that embody the Anishinaabe practice of Nishnaabewin. The story of the giant beaver is one of imbalance, persistence, diplomacy, and generated consensus. The person who married a beaver instructs us on consent, the political economy between Anishinaabe and beavers, and demonstrates a world made out of deep reciprocity, diplomacy, and respect. Anablog demonstrates a different kind of blockade, one that nonetheless intervenes, brings attention to destructive acts, and in the end demonstrates the use of oneself to propel more life. The last story, Amick, is both a negation of colonialism and an affirmation of life-giving beaver practices and knowledge. Amick is a messy resurgence. we have some choices. We can stand beside the pile of sticks blocking the flow of the river and complain about inconvenience, or we can sit beside the pond and witness the beaver's life-giving brilliance. Blockades are both a refusal and an affirmation of a different political economy, a world built upon a different set of relationships and ethics, an affirmation of life. That's why the words of Frida Husen, spokesperson of the Unastaden camp, speaks to the hearts of Indigenous people all across Kinakong when she says, "Our people's belief is that we are part of the land. The land is not separate from us. The land sustains us, and if we don't take care of her, she won't be able to sustain us, and we as a generation of people will die." That's why queer, trans, and two-spirit artists and young people were once again on the front lines, leading solidarity occupations in Vancouver and Victoria, in the prairies and beyond. That's why Mohawk land protectors at Tyendinaga blocked the tracks. That's why a few short years ago, thousands organized and gathered at Standing Rock to block the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is why in 1995, the Ogoni 9 were executed for the refusal of Shell in Nigeria. This is why the Freedom School in Toronto made a tremendous Black Kids stand with Wet'suwet'en banner in a joyful expression of solidarity. This isn't about pipelines or jobs or the best way to get our message about. This is about land and life for generations to come. This is about the kind of worlds we collectively want to live in: Indigenous worlds, Black worlds, Beaver worlds, anti-colonial worlds. So we can have the same old arguments we've been having for centuries about inconveniences and the extra-legal nature of blockades. We can pit jobs and the economy versus the environment. We can perform superficial dances of reconciliation and dialogue and negotiate for the cheap gifts of economic and political inclusion. Or we can imagine different worlds. We can remember the principal actions of the Dene Nation in the 1970s opposing the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, or the communities of Ganasatagi and Ganawage during the summer of 1990, and find ways to support families, clans, communities, and nations that are standing up and saying, no, you do not have our consent to build this golf course, pipeline, mine, hydro dam, clear cut, because we are very, very busy building a different world, and we are so deeply in love with our land, our cultures, our languages, and our families. It is that love and care that Carrier Witat, multidisciplinary artist and curator Wes Harmon, described emanating throughout the West Coast Wet'suwet'en solidarity protest sites, even in the face of state violence. Our current world is on fire, warming and melting at an unprecedented rate. The whole world should be standing behind the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in their clan, paying attention to the world they are refusing, observing how life behind the blockades renews a different visioning, and witnessing the negation, the affirmation, and the generative refusal of blockades and those precious beaver dams. Ni bwa kewen, wewene, miwa, miigwech. Hi, hi. Please take care of each other. Thank you.
I'm Lenny Lenape from the Great Lakes area, and my totem or clan is Turtle Clan, and I noticed like you used like the turtle as a joke in like your beaver stories, and I was just wondering if you have wrote about turtles at all, or have like looked into turtles because like they are known as like the grandfathers of like water creatures, I guess.
Yeah, so I think in the story, I was using that relation or that ancestor of the turtle as someone who was sort of in the cafe observing something and who was present but wasn't intervening. I haven't written specifically about turtles the way that I've just written about beavers, although I could. There's so much, there's lots of great turtle knowledge and turtle stories. Or maybe you should, since you're from the turtle clan. Yeah, it's a great idea.
My name is Mukonzi. I'm from Kenya. I just wanted to have a quick question about the cultural understanding of the animals in the community. For me, they end up kind of informing how you will readdress certain issues and kind of speak to a contemporary audience, and I really appreciated that. And my question was, how does that continually, is it something that keeps evolving in their reimagination? Is there a reimagination that keeps changing?
Well, the first two stories tonight are very, very old stories. And then the last two stories are brand new stories that I wrote for you guys tonight. So yes, I think that there is a responsibility on the part of storytellers to make sure that each generation is connecting with the stories and able to find meaning in the stories, and able to take the stories with them and sort of think about them and wrestle with them. I think the core of how we would think of the turtle or the beaver doesn't shift. But I think for me, I like to kind of use that core to speak to sort of certain contemporary issues that my community is dealing with, and maybe illuminate something through using that kind of metaphorical approach to examining.
My name is Callie. I'm a third-year student in ecology here at the U of A, and I've read your work, and thank you so much for everything that you've shared tonight. What I wanted to ask is, so what do you think is the way forward for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in terms of how we can continue to support the Wet'suwet'en people and other similar struggles? Because I think that during the times of the blockades, during the times when the invasions of the blockades are happening, when it's really visible in the news, that it's a lot easier for people to be aware and to be able to support the struggle. But then, I guess what I'm asking is, how can we keep up the momentum?
That's one of the difficult questions about organizing in Indigenous contexts, because we don't have a lot of resources and time for organizing outside of these kind of crisis points. So one of the reasons why I chose blockades and beaver dams, and I chose this topic months and months and months ago, was because I think we need to be talking in our communities and in our kind of urban collectives about the kinds of questions that you're asking all the time. So not just when we're in moments of crisis, and I think that's for non-Indigenous peoples as well. I think in these interstitial times of calm, this is where we need to sort of go back into our different knowledge systems and consider and talk and continue to organize. And I think that's a very, very important question about how we sustain our organizations, and how this is a very strange point in time. You don't want to lose the momentum, but now we're in a pandemic. So I think broadly we need to talk about how to stay mobilized and stay organized from kind of crisis to crisis. So I wonder what that would have looked like had we been having these kinds of discussions through Idle No More and continue to do the work in non-crisis times, I wonder where we would be now. I wonder if we would be in the same spot.
Thank you so much, Leanne, and thank you all for being here.